So I'm watching Dr. James Tabor go through a series he's been producing on Daniel. And this is kind of off the cuff because couldn't sleep. So I won't get into that. But he's basically presented, I'm going to try to direct this at Dr. Tabor and hope he watches it. But he's presented what seems to be kind of maybe I missed something in the first videos, but it's kind of operating from the position that Daniel was written, not in 600 BC as the text suggests, but sometime in the middle of the prophecies, historically, which would have been Babylon, after Babylon, and I guess during the Third Empire, in like the 200 BCs. It's not the 600 BCs, which the text operates as though it was written at that time, as though Daniel was 600 BC-ish, in that range. I'm not sure if he went into the issues with what the difference can be based on how, let's call it, secular interpreters would presume, and not like the believing view of Christians anyway. So it's basically arguing that the fourth kingdom is not indeed Rome from Daniel 2, but it's Antiochus, which that's why I'm saying it seems like he's operating, though, kind of predicting what will happen within the Greek Empire when Daniel would be written from that view. But the problem is, as he mentions in his video number 3, which I can enlarge here, maybe zoom in on it a bit. I'll put the link I'm going to play some of it and then comment on it. But I want to ask a few questions about, from a non-believing perspective, issues I see with taking it this way. For one, Daniel 2 through Daniel 7 is written in Aramaic. And then Daniel 8 through 12 and part of the first chapter of Daniel 2 is written in Hebrew. So presumably, if you take the view of authorship, you don't necessarily think a single author at least wrote it all, but he's putting it together and it's attributed to Daniel. The issue is 2 and 7 would then be in that written by the same author. And so if 7 suggests that they're developing the prophecy as they're realizing they have to make it Rome in 7, because it's clearly not Antiochus in 7. It's clearly Rome. Shouldn't that inform that 2 never really was intended to be Antiochus? Or you must take 2 different authorships for Daniel 2 and Daniel 7, I suppose. I'd be curious about that. Well, then I'll play the video and go from there, since this is off the cuff here.
Most scholars read it. But the court shall sit in judgment. So when Antiochus was defeated, you should have had the end of the age. The court should have sat in judgment. God's people should have been delivered. They should have taken over. And the kingdom should have manifested itself and last forever, just like in chapter 2.
That kind of highlights. I'd like to hear him speak to that. How do you understand the authorship of Daniel 2 to Daniel 7, considering they're both in the Aramaic and the original, and then Daniel 8 is. So like if 2 is Antiochus and then 7, and then you're saying 7 really doesn't suggest that it's showing a development that it can't be Antiochus, because they're realizing that hasn't come to pass. And so you have this developmental theory kind of thing. How can you then make Daniel 8 Antiochus? Presumably that would be part of the earlier or later parts of Daniel. I'd ask that question. So, because it seems more likely that 7 seems so much more written as though it's presuming Rome, but then you have, that would seem to inform Daniel 2. So I'd like to know if you think Was Daniel 8 written after or before Daniel 2 and Daniel 7? And then how would you make that make sense based on what I'm asking? Hopefully that makes sense. Seems like 7, which is in Aramaic. And then you have to ask, 7 gives you the time times and half a time, which is 3.5 years, as he goes on to say, which is 1,260 days on a lunar calendar. But of course, Daniel, whenever even if the authorship is 600 BC or in the 200s BC during the Greek Empire, any part of it, all of it or parts of it, wouldn't the author know that the Jewish people they don't actually use a lunar calendar? They use the lunisolar calendar. So wouldn't the author know that these periods are not to be taken literally? That's kind of my argument, my thinking. It's like, of course, I'm a Seventh-day Adventist who takes the day year principle as intended by the authors in its authorship. And I, of course, take the 600 BC single authorship date, or at least that Daniel actually put it together and wrote it, at least the Hebrew part of it. I don't know. I don't know that much about that part, but what the issues are totally. But it just seems that the author would have known whether either period when, or that. How can he be giving? They didn't use lunar time rendering for their years in Babylon or in Palestine, Judea. So how do you make sense of that? That seems to me to indicate the author certainly is not. I mean, after all, it's symbolic, right? This apocalyptic literature has almost entirely symbols, except for maybe the explanation you can argue isn't obviously symbolic. It's the interpretation, but it is interesting that they use increments of time that are never used in the Hebrew text for historical narrative. Say like 3 years and 6 months, usually something like that. And they use every kind of reckoning of time that isn't used in literal narrative. They basically exhaust all these different ways of saying the same thing: time times and half a time, 3.5 years, 1,260 days, which would be based on 12 months and 30 days per month, which isn't what they were using. And while I'm on a roll, I guess I'll get to my question, which may have been better to have more explanation based on what Dr. Tabor said. But I know, Dr. Tabor, I've heard you, and by the way, I really enjoyed if you see this, your stuff on the conception of death and the restoration of Israel. And I take a similar view of the text on how they thought of death. And although I think I disagree with you about what Paul's actually saying in some parts, although I largely agree. But if Paul and the early Christians, is indicated by the text, think the kingdom of God is imminent in the first century, the believing Christians, let's say, and based on what Paul says, we think he expected, and which you get from 1 Corinthians, of course, and other parts of Paul's letters, there is indication that he was expectant of Christ returning, right? Okay, Paul's written after the gospel. Well, I guess not written after the gospels, but how do you understand? It seems like the author of Luke, at least. Let's look at that. Let me switch screens. Seems like within the text of particularly Luke 3. Let's see. It's chapter 4 here. How would you explain, like here in Luke, setting up Jesus' baptism in the 15th year of Tiberius? Talked about Caiaphas being the high priest, John the Baptist ministry. He's preaching, make way for the way, or prepare for the way of the Lord, make his path straight. All flesh shall see the salvation of God. Do you take that to have occurred historically? And do you suspect that he was preaching that? And if so, where did he get that idea, John? How much of the story about John being related to Joseph and Mary do you take to be historical, for one? That's one question. And then in the narrative here, in regards to John preaching about the coming Messiah, we see that the text indicates that they seem to believe it and that they're in expectation. Are they only in expectation because John's preaching it? And if so, either the writer of Luke seemed to say the people were in expectation. We have that here in verse 15. Were there, in light of the Qumran scrolls, etc., do you think that it was a general idea that the Messiah was expected? What's informing that, do you suppose, that the Messiah was expected at that time? Was it their interpretation of Daniel 9 or something else? That's what I would be curious about. Seems like that's probably historical based on evidence we have that you've mentioned. I'd be curious what you think about that. And then also in the next chapter. Okay, so if Paul thinks that, and this all is going to relate to your explanation of this gap in history and the interpretation of Daniel 2 and 7. Okay, I believe that the text intends there to talk about that gap because I believe the 1260 days are years, not days. And that actually flows with the context of the successive kingdoms being over long stretches of history. And we see now, with all that in mind, because in Luke 4, how do you understand this? If the early church and Paul himself, presumably the writers of the Gospels, expect history to end, which kind of goes along with your thesis of how to interpret Daniel, and of course you would say that would fail, and you speak to the preterism, etc. view in the next video. Where is this? Like when Jesus is in the temple after his baptism here in chapter 4, he opens to Isaiah. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to preach deliverance to the captives, recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty them that are bruised, to preach the acceptable year of the Lord. And he says, today this scripture is fulfilled in your ears. Okay. Sorry, I'm getting to the point here. Like when you go to Isaiah, I think it's Isaiah 61. Let me go there quickly here. Sorry, I should have planned this out better. With all he stops right here to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord in the middle of a sentence. And it's in the narrative of the gospel. And the day of vengeance of our God to comfort all that mourn. Do you think that was in the original text of Luke? What kind of dating do you put on it? Because it seems like there's this idea that they expect it to be soon. And all the passages of the day of vengeance of our God, and Jesus doesn't read that part of it. Seems like that. Are you going to say that he really, like, if the man Jesus in history actually did that in Luke 4 here, and it's faithfully recorded, seems like you have to argue, you'd have to believe that, because otherwise, if not, you'd have to say that the writers of the New Testament inserted that idea to argue for, because Jesus never came back right away. So this is like a thing you'd put in the text to make it plausible, because he didn't come back right away. But then you argue that the early authors and Paul and the early church, I think I don't necessarily disagree. They thought it was imminent. So like, who put this in the text? Who did that? You can't make this stuff up. Maybe I'm missing something, but that seems like a strong indicator that a critical historian would say, well, yeah, so this is the kind of thing you'd say they did. And they would add to the narrative to help explain prophecy not coming true like they expected. But yet there it is. And we have all this other evidence says, no, they expected him to come. So then how did that get in there? What motivated it? That's what I'd be curious how you'd explain that. God bless.